What I want to present today is new research that I'm doing, or a new area that I'm examining. So this is the first time I'm actually presenting this. You're getting really fresh ideas. So I really look forward to any kind of comments or feedback you have, because I'm just beginning to think about these issues. What I'm going to subject you to is some of my hobbies, which is I'm obsessed with newspapers. If I want to academicize what I do, I guess I could say I'm a Gramscian. He did most of his analysis by reading newspapers, so there you go. It's not just me reading newspapers. But what I will present are some headlines from newspapers, intersect it with some observations and a bit of a systematic analysis that I've done of existing literature, and offer some insights on what I think would be a sociology in an age of robotics and AI. Which I think is something that is desperately needed for the social sciences. So I got into thinking about these issues after seeing headlines like this over the last 5 or so years. So this is a fairly recent headline, which is projecting that 45% of jobs are going to be taken over by robots, taken over by artificial intelligence. If you look at Canadian-specific projections, the Conference Board of Canada projects that it's going to be something like 35 to 42% of jobs that we know today in the next 10 to 20 years will be replaced by artificial intelligence or robots. If we think about that for a minute, that's a fundamental shift in our economy. It's a fundamental shift in how we're going to relate with one another. And I began asking myself, well, what does that mean in terms of the sociology that we practice, or the sociology I practice, and what can sociology offer to understanding this shift? Being a bit of an empiricist, one of my other big things in life is I love to play with data. And I thought to myself, am I just alone at freaking out at these headlines, or are other people freaking out too? So what I did was I went to an underused element of Google called Google Trends. And Google Trends, if you haven't used it, is a great little kind of device where you can find out what is trending in the world and gives you some plotting of who's saying what. At the top end of the scaling is 100, at the bottom end is 0. 100 means that it's the peak time of people searching for a word. In this case, it's the word robot. To make things a little clearer, I've given a red line to show the trending. And this is looking from the last 5 years, so it's 2012 to present. And you'll see that there's a general increase in interest in robots. But that seems to have gone down in the last year. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I'm just overreacting. Things are, people are getting less interest in this. I'm just obsessing over a few headlines. Well, I kind of sat back and I thought about it for a little bit. And I thought, well, maybe I'm using the wrong keyword. So I did another search, this time with artificial intelligence. And what you'll notice is where the robots drop off, artificial intelligence picks up. So people are starting to use the two words interchangeably. And people are reacting to the kind of headlines that I presented to you. They're starting to try and figure out what's going on, and they're trying to search for this information. Now, I'm going to use robots and AI interchangeably, but they're fundamentally different things. So robots are the nuts and bolts, they're the machinery, they're the skeleton of things that move around. Artificial intelligence is the programming or the software that goes into that machine that allows it to navigate its processes or process information. Artificial intelligence is also algorithms that exist without any physical existence, and that in particular algorithms that are engaging in things like deep learning or machine learning, which allow computers to process huge amounts of information. Things like Watson, if you've heard of IBM's AI, would be this kind of thing. Now, as I began to look at these things, I began thinking about technological increases. And the CBC has been running some really interesting stories through their Ideas series. And one of the Ideas series that was curated or hosted by Dan Falk, who's a science journalist, ended up having a speaker who talked about Moore's Law and also linked it to Paul Pesam, which I can explain if you're not familiar with Paul Pesam. Just as a show of hands, how many are aware of Paul Pesam? Okay, it's a holiday in India, and it's a great example of how exponential change works. So Moore's law is fairly straightforward. Moore's law is a law that says that roughly every 18 months, computing power will double. And many people argue that Moore's law applies to artificial intelligence, which means that every 18 months, artificial intelligence will double in its capacity. And I think that, when you hear these kinds of things, they're not that shocking if you don't think about them in terms of what that means, which is why I want to talk a little bit about Paul Pesam. So this is a holiday that exists in parts of India, and it's a holiday that has its origins between a king, which is portrayed here over on the left, and Krishna. And the king was a chess enthusiast and challenged Krishna to a chess game. And in the chess game, the king said, for every square that you win, I'll put whatever, for if you win the game, I will give you any prize that you wish. And Krishna wisely said, well, all I ask is that you put a grain of rice on every square that I win, but you double it for every other square. So, the first square, if Krishna wins, he gets 1 grain of rice. The second square, he gets 2 grains of rice, 4 grains of rice, 8 grains of rice, and so forth. Well, by the time Krishna won the game, there were 64 squares. And the king, to his credit, honored the bet. But if you do exponential math, by the time you get to 64 squares, you have 18 quadrillion grains of rice. So think about that for a second. If you're not familiar with what 18 quadrillion is, the number is, and I have to look at my notes because there's so many zeros, is 18, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 grains of rice. So in real terms, what this actually means is a layer of rice that would cover the world twice over. And that's just in 64 iterations using exponential calculation. So if you take a moment and think about what this means in terms of Moore's law, and in terms of computing power and AI or robotics, it means that we are facing a rapid change. And if you look at the last 5 to 10 years in robotics, you can see the rise of Asimo, which is Honda's robot, which is the first humanoid-looking functional robot that has balance. You can see the rise of iLimbs, in other words, robotic limbs that you can control with your brain function. You see the rise of e-skin, which is skin that masks over a skeleton that looks like human skin and functions in an organic way. You see brain-controlled robotics emerging in the last 2 to 3 years. If we look at AI, we see all kinds of things such as speech recognition, visual recognition. We see the rise of deep learning. We see that the Turing test has been passed. If you're unfamiliar with the Turing test, I have a great piece of homework for you. Go back and watch the original Blade Runner. And if you look at the original Blade Runner as Harrison Ford is interviewing the AI or the robot, the Turing test is basically a point at which a robot or an artificial intelligence can convince a human that they may be human. So the Turing test was passed just a few years ago. Google Translate created its own language through machine learning. So it's the first time a new language was created by artificial intelligence. And I could give you further and further examples. It's exponential. I could be here until the end of our lifetime giving you examples of all the changes that have happened in the last couple of years. All right, so this has led some groups, such as the World Economic Forum, to argue that we are entering a fourth industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution is the rise of water and steam power. The second industrial revolution was the rise of electronics and electricity. The third industrial revolution is the rise of digital computing and the digital age. And the World Economic Forum is saying we're about to embark on a fourth industrial revolution, or we're in the process of a fourth industrial revolution of AI and robotics. Now, as a sociologist, anytime I hear industrial revolution, that makes my mind it has a special part in my mind. Because most of sociology is a reaction to the first industrial revolution. If you look at Karl Marx, you look at Max Weber, you look at Emile Durkheim, they're all writing about transitions from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. So it made me think that the sociology we have is not where we need it to be to engage a fourth industrial revolution. It's engaging that first industrial revolution. Then I thought to myself, well, hang on a second. There are people like Frantz Fanon. There are people who have written in the 60s. There's Michel Foucault. Maybe hold your horses. It doesn't all go back to Max Weber and Karl Marx and Emile Durkheim. And as I began to think about that sociology is a sociology of the 1960s. And again, I started asking myself, well, what are social scientists doing to engage this fourth industrial revolution that we're in the midst of? So being a bit of a lazy guy, I asked one of my research assistants, my PhD student, Emma Kay, to do a systematic review of literature looking at a set of key words. So we looked through two, or I should say she looked through two databases, SOCINDEX as well as SOCAbstracts, with the keywords that you see there. If you're unfamiliar with Boolean searches, the stars simply mean that you use every derivative of the word after the star. So it's a more efficient way of searching multiple words. You'll notice that when we did this, that you can see that there are a lot of articles that come up in terms of culture or society. But what really fascinated me and what I'm interested in working on are all the things that I call the boring elements of looking at the changes that will happen with AI and robotics. So, as was noted in the introduction, I tend to work in social justice. I look at issues of power. I work in terms of immigration, race relations, indigenous relations. I do demography. And if you look at where I just threw up the arrows, that conversation's not yet happening in sociology. That conversation is not part of what is going on. So I asked Emma Kay after she showed me these results, well, can you help me kind of group through the themes of what sociologists are doing when they are engaging these keywords in their articles? And you can have a debate with me on whether these people are actually sociologists just because they end up in the database. But everybody's a sociologist for me today. When I did that, or when Emma Kay worked on that, she identified these kinds of themes of work that's being done in the social sciences on AI and robotics, mentioning the keywords that I presented. So robots as laborers, social robots or care workers, a lot of focus on the health sciences. There's some research on human-robot interaction. There's literature on ethics or warfare and space travel and robotics, as well as culture and, for lack of a better word, futurology. And when you go through these, and I'll drill down into them a little bit. We don't have a ton of time, and I want to make sure there's some time for discussion. When you drill into these, you find some interesting analysis. In a lot of languages, and many English speakers take this for granted, but in a lot of language, robotnik or robot actually means laborer, if you go back to the etymology of robot. In other languages, it means peasant, it means worker. So if you look at German, Czech, Russian, Slavic languages, this is actually the etymology of robot. In this literature, there's a lot of focus on the things that were in the headline. How many jobs are going to be taken? What is the world going to look like if you have unemployed workers? There's a little bit of a revisiting, a dusting off of that famous leisure world thesis that emerged in the 1970s as we began to engage in the digital age. And of course, all of us are all living a life of leisure, right? No, it didn't come to fruition. So people are beginning to re-examine that. And others are examining kind of what it means to have labor in terms of this. And this is a picture from a Toyota plant. If you notice, there's something missing here. There's not a lot of folks, not a lot of people, that it's robot labor. Well, the other set of literature looks at robots as care work and looking at robots in the health sciences. And this is a headline that I really like because I actually began looking at some of these issues by arguing that Japan is engaging its demographic dilemmas, its aging population and low fertility rate through robotics. And this headline shows really how people are looking at immigrants or robots, which is a puzzle that I think is an important conversation to have, which I'll talk about a little bit later. In terms of this kind of writing or this kind of analysis, people are looking at robots in terms of allowing people to have their own freedom. So actually a lot of older people prefer to have robots than care workers. This is because it allows them to actually have independence. It looks at what it means to have medicine with robots. It looks at how people, to some extent, relate to these robots in terms of their personal needs and care. Which brings us to another theme that exists in the literature, which is human-robot interactions. This is a literature that largely focuses on marketing, on whether workers are going to be Luddites and throw wrenches into the machine or mess up the algorithms. It's looking at how people are going to navigate social relations, looking at the social consequences of bringing machines into groups. The other theme that is very much out there is the ethics around robots. So many of my philosopher colleagues at Dalhousie are engaging in issues of automated cars. And what are the ethics of an automated car? It's like going back to your intro to philosophy class. Do you run over the neighbor's kid to save the busload of people or the neighbor's pet? Or do you save that one person and sacrifice the busload of people? So this is an area of research. There's also a lot of work around drones and a lot of looking at warfare as increasingly police services and militaries are turning to machines to do their dirty work. The last theme that we came across was futurology, or what does a culture look like if it's a robotic culture or a robot, android, human mixed culture. And basically it's playing out the scenario of Astro Boy, which is the classic Japanese anime looking at a boy, it's the Japanese version of Pinocchio, but looking at robotics. But as I finished reading Emma Kay's report on this, and as I began looking through additional stuff that she coded, which I'm not presenting, I began asking myself, well, that's a pretty narrow social world that's out there, and that social science does a lot more than just looking at those issues. And I began to ask myself, in particular, questions about how does a sociology of AI and robotics look in terms of the kinds of things that I engage in. So in particular, social policy, related to this, demography and methods, what do power and politics or polities look like? What are the ordering principles of a society that are human-robot interactions? And what will social relations look like? And much, much more. So the more boring it is, the more interested I am actually in the effects of robotics on society. So if you bear with me, I'm going to play with some of these ideas a little bit to give you a sense of where I'm going. So I want to commit some sociology and think about what committing sociology is in this kind of robot world. What does a sociology of the fourth industrial revolution look like rather than a sociology of the first industrial revolution or the 1960s? So one of the things that I think is important to begin doing is to think about what does social policy look like in a world of AI and robotics. And if we look at other rapid changes that have happened in the last 20 years, usually governments are very far behind in terms of creating legislation or policy to accommodate changes. So if we think about things like Facebook and fake news, right? An election was just won on fake news, alternative facts. The internet has been around for about 40 years. Accessible internet has been around for at least 15 or 20 years. And it's only now that people are beginning to ask, well, what role do Facebook and Google play in navigating information? What responsibilities do they have? Well, if you look at the headlines that I present here, governments, the assessment is pretty clear that governments are pretty much unprepared for this fourth industrial revolution. That businesses are also falling behind technology. That people are not necessarily thinking about what's the world going to be like with this kind of change. So when I think about social policy, one of the first things that comes to mind is the work of demographer David Foote. And I think that if there's one thing that you take home from this sharing of information with you, it's an observation of David Foote in his Boom, Bust, and Echo. And he has a persuasive line where he says, the problem with policy is that policymakers make the policy for tomorrow based on today. So think about that for a second, making the policies of tomorrow based on today. So in particular, he's a demographer, and he was one of the first people to recognize that Canada was about to engage in a period of low fertility and aging population. And he kept getting frustrated at all the energy that was being put into saving infrastructure for a baby boom young population and not creating policy for an aging baby boom population or considering how to stabilize the population growth in the country. Well, to me, what this means in terms of AI and robotics is how do we create a demography of robots based on this exponential growth curve? What are the steps that we need to take in order to make just policy based on what we know today? Well, my first reaction to this, we need a census. We had a national household survey in 2011. We had a human census in 2016, or 2015. The last new results got presented just last week. Well, I said to myself, if we want to know what's going on, we actually need to have some information. And I, went into Google and I saw, I have this belief that you only know if you're original if you go into Google and you can't find anything that's already been done on it. I put it into Google, and sure enough, somebody at Carnegie Mellon, a research university in the United States, did a robot census. And it's gained quite a bit of headline. And what it does is it tries to focus on, what are the robots doing? What are the AI doing? Where are they in the university? What are the needs being met? Basically the same kind of demographic census you would do with people, but this time looking at machines. When I presented this to the chief statistician back in April, Canada's chief statistician, he said, I've never thought of this. Write me a memo. Let me think about this. This does have some implications. Well, the other thing I thought about in terms of demography is going back to that headline, and a year ago I presented a paper in Japan on this, robots are immigrants. And this is something that I'm very curious about because Canada's immigration system is a system based on the economy. The biggest category of immigrants that come to Canada, the new immigration targets will be announced this week, so this is still valid until the announcement. I have no idea what's going to be announced, but the trend for the last 30 years has been to focus on economic migrants. Well, is that the right focus if we're going to enter into an economy where 42% of the jobs are gone? Is that really the problem that is addressed with immigration? Maybe immigration is going to have to change. Maybe it means that immigrants as the fueling of economic growth will be still the issue, but maybe it'll be a more rich look at immigrants, not just as Homo economicus, but looking at immigrants as culturally relevant, looking at immigrants in terms of seeding another generation, of plugging into the world, etc. So there will be implications in terms of all elements of demography. Well, I also started thinking about some of the works that have influenced some of my writing. I thought about what will happen to states, right? So Michael Mann is a sociologist who wrote about states, which are the main container of power for the 20th century and the early 21st century. And he identifies different sources of social power, economic power, social cultural power, institutional power, militaristic power. Well, are states going to be relevant in an age of AI and robotics? What allegiance do AI and robots have to states? States largely get their wealth and their power from collecting taxes. Do robots pay taxes? I don't think so. And we don't even know because we don't have a demographic asset of who the robots are, who may be paying taxes. Well, I thought, well, hang on a second. I've watched sci-fi. I saw The Terminator. Maybe there's going to be a revolution. Charles Tilly writes about revolution. And then I started thinking about it. I said, well, probably not a revolution of robots, probably not a Terminator, but maybe there will be people who use robots and use AI to achieve their political ends. What will the repertoire of contention be with these new tools? We already see that in terms of Occupy. Social media changed how people did protest. How will people do protest in an age of AI and robots? Well, the other work, which is not directly sociological, is the work by Wendy Hui-Kyung-chun, who has done some very interesting writing in terms of the demography of those who write computer programs and algorithms that are behind AI, recognizing that there are social biases and patterns behind the algorithms that are created. So I began with these kind of works, thinking about some issues, and I came across a headline from Vladimir Putin, who very quickly recognized that the leader in artificial intelligence is going to rule the world. This is a quote from Putin from, I believe, last year. Actually, earlier this fall, sorry. In terms of Canada, our Minister of Democracy warned that one of the greatest challenges in our era is basically algorithms that control information in responding at a conference about fake news and alternate facts. In other words, the state is being questioned. Maybe we will have states replaced with things like allegiances to Amazon or Apple. I know it sounds facetious, but you know, in the first industrial revolution, feudal lords were replaced by states because they were more effective at meeting the needs of the changing society. Are we about to embark on that? Well, it led me to also look at social bias, which is already being covered, but there are all kinds of biases that you can see in these algorithms. Biases that are gender biased. If you have 80 to 90% of the machine learning being written by men, it's going to see the world like men. If you have 80 or 90% of the machine learning being written by people from privileged backgrounds, it'll be a class-biased machine learning. On the flip side of this, social sciences contributed understandings of digital divide. Are we going to have an AI and robotics divide? Are there going to be some people who aren't going to be able to learn about Python, not going to be able to learn to do computer programming, not going to be able to access the robots that allow other people more free time and leisure? So these are things that are important to begin thinking about as we go forward, and the kind of things that sociologists can contribute to a discussion of AI and robotics. Well, what about social justice? How does social justice look in an age of AI and robotics? That, you know, it's widely recognized that there are no established methods to test AI safety, fairness, or effectiveness. What happens when you start relying on policing that uses facial recognition software and there's no longer a person? It's bad enough that we have carding already. Imagine what a world looks like when there's not a human behind the processes that go into effect in terms of policing and monitoring and securitization. Well, likewise, what does it mean in terms of those who are underprivileged in order to be able to access things to achieve fairness? All right, this led me to yet another train of thought, which is from Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot, which comes from their work on justification, which is if the state begins to erode, if notions of justice begin to change, it means that our ordering principles begin to change. Our ordering principles are the way that we process information, resolve disputes. So far, for the last 40 years or so, our ordering principles have largely been dominated by austerity and neoliberalism. It's been, you know, as Clinton famously said, it's the economy silly, or the economy stupid. It's all been about taxes, about lowering things, about efficiency, about individuals. Well, how does that work in an AI robotics world? Well, what does regulation mean? Elon Musk has been warning governments around the world that maybe it's time to start thinking about regulating AI and robotics. Bill Gates has been doing the same. What kind of principles are we going to enshrine as we go forward to have a more socially just society with AI and robots? Well, how about taxation? Who's going to pay the bills in an AI and robot society? Is it going to be corporations that pay lower taxes than people in Canada? So corporations actually pay a lower tax than the average Canadian citizen. Are the robots themselves going to pay taxes? We have a very different element here. If people aren't paying taxes, how are states going to maintain themselves? Which leads me to my last set of social science thoughts before kind of wrapping up, which is returning back to the classic work of Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan wrote about the new technology that was changing the world, television. And he was trying to help people understand how that was going to impact the world. And what he did was he essentially recognized the difference in mediums being that most mediums are an extension of our humanity, that they are tools that we use to navigate the world. And it's important to think in that terms. Well, other people such as Donna Haraway say, no, hang on a second, we're cyborgs. I know that the first time I heard Donna Haraway speak about 15 years ago at McGill, I laughed. I thought I was not hearing her right. I said, cyborgs? No, that's silly. She was way ahead of her time. You know, she began looking at how we navigate our world through a mediated world, a machine-mediated world. You know, I couldn't give this talk to you right now without my cyborg attachment, these funny glasses. Now I can't see you at all. Well, there I am. I'm a cyborg. So, you know, this is something that we take for granted. But what does it mean as, you know, we have exoskeletons that we control with our mind to allow us to have more mobility as we get older? This is the world we're about to get into in terms of AI and robotics. Well, Bruno Latour has done a lot of writing in terms of thinking of the world and thinking of society through our relation to things, what he calls actants. In other words, rather than a priori thinking about a human-centered world, start looking at how humans readjust ourselves according to our built environment, to machines. You know, how many of you went through that entrance of the building versus that entrance of the building so you could avoid the line up at the elevator and take the escalator? How did that affect your social relations? Who did you run into? These are the kinds of things that Bruno Latour begins to think about and give us some of the tools to start thinking about a world with AI and robots. It begins to allow us to start questioning who is or what is a robot or not a robot. Because if we're going to do our demography of robots and create a society or a census of robots, and we're going to tax robots, we need to know who and what they are. Are they going to be android-like things, which we see in this picture? Or are they going to be the Roomba, which I just love saying, Roomba, right? The Roomba is a robot that does the vacuuming in a lot of households. Is it going to be the machines on the auto plant? Is it going to be the algorithm that is giving us the information? This is an essential question, because if we're going to have a society where AI and robots are going to play a bigger role, we need to ask ourselves, will they have rights? And I know that sounds kind of a little far-fetched. Does a car have a right? Does your pen have a right? Do my glasses have a right? Well, corporations have rights. They're not people. In some countries, the environment have rights. Again, if this is going to be a reshaping of our society, we need to ask ourselves, will these things also have rights? And I love this headline coming out of Japan. Machines for work and play are idle, And I read the article, they were worried about those poor unemployed robots. So what rights will robots have? To be turned off, to have fair labor, etc. I don't know. It's exponentially changing. Now, I'm going to wrap up with two last thoughts. One from Yuval Harari, who is an Israeli researcher looking at AI and robotics. And his observation is that the AI revolution is not going to be a single watershed event. In other words, we're not going to wake up one day and we'll have a specific moment where we know that things were different the day before versus after. Instead, it's far more gradual. And if you think of other technological changes, they've been far more gradual too. Think about social media. There wasn't a single moment where social media came across. The internet, the same thing. The telephone, the same thing. Other technological changes haven't come in these sudden bursts. They've had major impacts with 2020 hindsight, but what is dangerous about technological change is that they are so subtle that you wake up one day and recognize that the world has changed and you don't have anything created to navigate it. Rather, I think that what we're going to see is what we've seen all along in terms of technology. And I will use a term from Japan called jidoka, which simply means automation rather than automation. And it's a term that's been patented from Toyota, which simply means that it's automation with a human touch. In other words, there's always a piece or room for the human within any kind of development. So on that note, I'm optimistic that there will be a sociology of AI and robotics, a sociology of the fourth industrial revolution. What it will be, I don't know, but I do know that we have to start thinking about it and start working with our colleagues across the university to be part of this. So thank you.